You're watching News 24. I'm Erin Bates. We're live from our Cape Town studios, and I'm sitting down with Associate Professor Richard Calland. He's just written and released a new book which deals with South African politics and 6 pertinent questions about what's going on in the zeitgeist, if you will, in current South African public life. And Professor, I'm very glad to have you here. We can get some comments on Thuli Madonsela and Praveen Gordhan. A massive week for news in South Africa.
Huge, Erin, and I feel that many of the big issues that in my book, Make or Break, I say are going to be answered over the next 3 years and which will set the course for the next 30. It's the subtitle of the book. I feel as if that 2 or 3 of them are coming together this very week and will perhaps be answered even in the next 24 hours, at least some of them.
One question that wasn't answered today was what's in the Public Protector's report on state capture. And interesting, she in fact pointed out it's not about state capture per se, it's about very specific questions on the Gupta family. What are your thoughts about what's happened this afternoon with the Public Protector?
Well, look, we're still speculating until we get the report and go through it carefully. Obviously, like you, I was very interested in what she had to say about it. If it's just about the Guptas, that's in a sense disappointing because, as others have pointed out, the notion of state capture goes beyond one family. It really should be looking at the extent to which powerful, wealthy individuals have been able to seize influence within government over a longer period of time. However, the Guptas, of course, are perhaps the leitmotif for that through the lens of the Guptas, we will learn a lot about how people or corporates operate to try and seize hold of public power.
One of the questions that definitely came up today was around her successor, Advocate Busisiwe Mkhwebane, and what sort of baton she now takes on as she steps into the role. It's something you deal with in your book as well, the role, the office of the Public Protector. I thought it was interesting that the Deputy Public Protector emphasized the institution of that office. What are your thoughts and what does your book kind of cover in terms of the Public Protector?
So institutions, we've all learnt, are tremendously important to us. And we've seen institutions that have succeeded and been effective, like the Public Protector. We've also seen institutions that have been captured, such as the National Prosecution Authority, or South African Airways, or the SABC. And so I think the public now understands the notion of state capture. They can see it that a healthy, vibrant, strong, independent institution, and they can see one that isn't those things. The question is, will the strong ones remain strong, and can we recover the weak ones? And if we go beyond the ones we've discussed so far to the courts are a huge asset to South Africa. We have this very powerful rule of law, and the Public Protector is associated with that. Without the strong rule of law and the courts to back her, she would be weakened. Now, Advocate Mkhwebane comes into office with a spotlight on her, and we're all asking the question, can she live up to Thuli Madonsela's legacy? And the fact we're asking that question, the fact the spotlight is on her is very important and very useful, and I think it puts a lot of pressure on her. Kevin Malunga, the Deputy Public Protector, is quite right to say that it's not just about the rock star at the top in the case of Thuli Madonsela. She should be leaving behind, and I think she is, a strong institutional legacy, and that legacy should continue. However, we also know from the experience of Tom Mayani at SARS, having just read Rogue Unit, the book by Van Logenberg and Adrian Lacay, how the arrival of Moyani in 2014 appears to have really dismantled or started a process of dismantling that institution by forcing the departure of the top people. Institutions are only as good as the quality of the people that are in them and that lead them.
Interesting what you say about the NPA, because again this week with all the news that we've seen, Sean Abrams being very insistent that he was acting as the head of an institution that's very robust, very secure, and very insistent on kind of, you know, crossing all its T's and dotting all its I's. But really those charges relate to something that Praveen Gordhan himself says is an administrative matter. The question of Ivan Pillay, his retirement package, and then being put on a 5-year fixed-term contract. So who's who in this zoo?
Yes, it's not good enough to just say, well, they're trifling offences, although they are trifling offences, because even trifling offences should be brought to justice.
Yes.
But what's important in this case is to recognise that this is a very good example of what we call, and what the academic literature now calls, selective prosecution, where you prioritise something that's actually relatively small against someone who is a political target, and set aside much more significant and important cases.
Hundreds
such as,
of fraud charges.
well, there
perhaps.
we go.
Yes.
So as Lawson Naidu of COSAC pointed out on Tuesday, when Mr. Abrahams, Africa Abrahams, protests his independence and his fearlessness, it rings hollow because he has resisted the opportunity to proceed strongly with the charges against Mr. Zuma, whilst jumping on this tiny charge as an excuse to prosecute the Minister of Finance, notwithstanding the huge impact that has upon our reputation, upon the economy, etc., etc.
I spoke with some of my colleagues from Fin24, interesting Praveen Gordhan talking this morning at the Thomson Reuters investment conference and saying he will be around for the midterm budget. He plans to be around into next year. Are you confident that a ratings downgrade is not on the cards? As he said, he's confident that we're going to ride out this storm?
He's fighting the good fight. And part of that fighting the good fight is to speak confidently about his own position, because he knows that there is a great deal of squeamishness out there about his position. There is a real fear in the markets that Praveen Gordhan will be shuffled out of the cabinet, that Zuma is using the charges against him as a pretext to remove him. Were that to happen, two things would follow. Firstly, I think it would have a devastating impact on our position in the markets and would lead inevitably to a downgrade in December. No doubt about that. Secondly, I think it would drive a huge wedge within the ANC. It would actually, I think, cause, not the ANC necessarily to split, but it would cause a massive divide. I think it would ensure that certain people in cabinet, in the ANC leadership, would resign on principle and stand up to Zuma. He, I think, must know this. So he must know that to fire Gordhan now would be a hugely dangerous roll of the dice. But Zuma is on the ropes. He's fighting for his political life, believe it or not. And the closer to the end of his political life he gets, the more bold, the more brave he is, and virtually anything is possible, therefore.
Interesting to see, lawyers for President Jacob Zuma announcing their intention to obtain an interdict against the release of the report, and then finding the next day that Des van Rooyen's lawyers followed suit. And you spoke about the kind of institution of the courts in South Africa, but here we're seeing that selective prosecution, or that kind of manipulating, or perhaps, if you take it fairly, using the courts as part of what's going on politically. There's a bigger game here. So,
the great paradox here is that, but for the strength of the rule of law and the independence of our judges, Jacob Zuma would probably be in prison now. He's been able to use the court system to get a fair hearing in court, and he's used it over many years to legally filibuster, as I put it. He uses it to delay the inevitable, and he's done that again with the state capture report. He's left it to the last minute to get this interdict, which the public protector has responded to in a dignified fashion by saying, fine, I won't release it until the court hears the matter in early November. On that occasion, Zuma and the others, Van Rooyen and so on, will have to convince the court that there is a major procedural unfairness there, which should prevent it being published. The courts are likely to take a pretty strong line in favour of the public protector, recognising her independence and recognising that the issues contained within this report are in the public interest.
Yes. I thought it was interesting and quite characteristic of her to decide to rather defer and hand over to her successor, but saying as well that she'd had a 4-hour meeting with the president, they'd gone through some of the questions, and she'd left them with him almost in good faith, and that something had changed between that meeting and the application or the intent to apply for the interdict.
Well, wouldn't we all like to have been a fly on the wall of that 4-hour meeting?
Yes.
It must have been quite extraordinary, and I suspect that the outcome from Zuma's perspective was, as ever, who is this person to stand in my way? Zuma's approach to power is that he has it, and it's his power, and why should anyone obstruct it in any way? And I think he would have been greatly irritated by that, and would then have jumped on the idea that actually this report would be damaging to him. He should have known that in any case, because he has been the overseer of this state capture. We all know that.
Do we though? Because I'm sure that there are people listening to this who think about white monopoly capital, they think about the dominance of the markets and the concern and the kind of sensitivity around our markets falling, and say that in fact there is too much emphasis on people like Praveen Gordhan and seeing them as sort of holy cows politically, people who must remain and shouldn't be meddled with.
There is that debate. My response to it is this: well, you've got to look at who's saying what about who. It's very interesting to me that people on the left of our political spectrum, who for so long have been fierce critics of national treasury, seen it as a kind of neoliberal construct that stands in the way of a more expansive approach to building the economy and so on. They have become great defenders of Pravin Gordhan.
I assume you're talking about the EFF.
I'm talking about the EFF, but I'm also talking about within the ANC, people like Rob Davies, Bladen Zamandi in the South African Communist Party, Kasatu and so on. All of these people have backed Gordhan because they know he's honest. They back Treasury because they know it's an institution that works, and because they understand that if Treasury was to be captured, you wave goodbye to social democracy. You cannot have a welfare state, you cannot have a big state-led infrastructure spend if your public finances are in disarray and are beholden to private interests, such as the Guptas.
So private interests in a political elite. And that's, I think, a very, very important point, because the question of Treasury is what impact it will have right down to the breadline. If we tank economically, as Karen Morn of ENCA put it, what does that do for the working class and the absolutely destitute in this country?
Well, the fifth question, my sixth in my book, Make or Break, says who will win out of Pravin and Zuma? And this isn't just palace politics. This is about who runs the government, but it's also about who does the economy serve. So if Pravin does not survive and falls, the effect will be a Brazil-like tailspin, where a leadership crisis combined with an economic crisis produces a devastating result for the economy. The people that will suffer, because prices will go up, there will be high inflation, the cost of borrowing will go up, the government's fiscal cliff will be fallen over, public expenditure will have to be cut. All of that will hit the hardest, the poorest people in this country. That is the devastating consequence of this. And the people that will benefit will be rich folks like the Guptas and others, who will then milk the cow.
The cow that's already kind of on its last legs at this point, it seems, in some ways. And we really are at an absolutely terrifying time in South Africa's kind of political history since 1994. I mean, I have days, honestly, where I don't know if there's lots of hope because all of the worms are coming out of the woodwork, or if it's really just a, expletive storm, like if we're just in the red.
It's that roller coaster, isn't it? And it does, I think, for veteran observers and analysts, it feels perhaps like the 80s even, with a sense of precariousness out there, of troops and policemen firing bullets, live ammunition on campuses. There's that sort of tension and that sense of vulnerability, I think, that was in the 80s before I came to South Africa, and in the early 90s. South Africa looked over the abyss then, and it came back from the brink. And I think we're in something of a similar situation here, and it's partly about the brink, but it's also about who will blink in the next few days. Will it be Zuma, or will it be people like Pravin Gordhan, Gwede Mantashe, Cyril Ramaphosa? And it's time for those people to back Gordhan and to act on principle.
You mentioned their fees must fall, and I think you're quite right about the atmosphere on those university campuses and the degree of force that we've seen, and the violence, violence from both parties, and then there's also the private security, which complicates things. You've got a third actor there. My question to you now then is around how bad things are. My sense is that we're almost, as a public, unable to acknowledge and come to terms with where things are. Maybe for many of us, the 80s is fresh or, not that far removed. And to acknowledge the degree, the number of red flags, the degree of trouble that we're in is almost too terrifying. What do we need to be looking out for in the next couple of months? I know your book deals with, the near to medium future. What do we need to be looking out for in terms of where we're going?
Well, the purpose of my book, Make or Break, is precisely that, is to help people interested in politics, who care about this country, to get a sense of what's happening and why, and to figure out what are the signposts on the roads ahead which will indicate which road we're taking. We're at this fork. There's a high road, there's a low road. There's reasons to be cheerful because we have some strong institutions. We have very good leaders in waiting, such as Seppo Pachana, who stood out stood up recently and been very vocal in his opposition to Jacob Zuma. We have good people in business. We have a very vibrant civil society. We have a constitution that not only is strong on paper but is used and can be enforced in courts. We have lots of good things. But we're also dealing with a very difficult political economy here, and an economy that is structured in a way that makes it very hard to create jobs and bring people out of poverty. And those two things combined with a very difficult global economy, in turn,
which adds more pressure.
So we've got to have the best leadership available. We've got to make smart choices, and that includes in our universities, which have become very precarious places. I've just come today from a crisis kind of assembly in the law faculty where I'm based at University of Cape Town, and the situation is very delicate. You've got people who are desperate to finish their studies and graduate, and you've got people who say that should not happen until we figure out how fees will be paid, and to create a level playing field, and also to decolonize our curriculum and power relations within our institutions of further learning, higher education.
Such pressing questions, and you spoke earlier about who will really suffer if we go through the kind of downward spiral that we saw in Brazil. And I think so telling on that front is very privileged, very elite students at South African universities who in a way won't bear the brunt of the consequences of protests because they can go to private institutions. Daddy can send them overseas, and it just complicated. I mean, the whole thing is just absolutely terrifying.
Complexity is the middle name of this game, and it's very difficult for the leadership of the university. There are no easy solutions. The government should recognise, however, that this is a national crisis. They should recognise that the universities need help. They should recognise that an intermediary is required, and that government is the only intermediary that can really do the job on this occasion. And besides all of that, it's the government that can release the funds and make the public policy choices which will really make a difference in this case. And the government has failed in this respect. It hasn't filled the role that it should play and hasn't understood what a serious crisis it is.
And it seems to date, at any rate, the intermediary they've chosen is the police force. I want to just touch on what you spoke about in terms of leadership. You said what we need now is really decisive, really clear-headed and sort of, informed leadership. Besides our president, there are the seconds and thirds in command. What do you make, what's your analysis of the response of people within the ruling party and how they've negotiated the question of Pravin Gordhan's charges this week and also the question of state capture?
So in the book I suggest that one day we'll trace Mr. Zuma's loss of power back to 9/12, as we like to call it now, when Nhlanhla Nene was fired summarily last December. And then replaced by Des van Rooyen from left field, and then 5 days later, of course, Pravin Gordhan was brought back. Now, that was such a grotesque misjudgment by President Zuma that he lost a lot of credibility. He also triggered a group within the ANC, Gordhan and Tash, what I call the moderate middle and the sensible left, finding their voice after a long period of kind of acquiescence and being an accomplice to this rot. And since then, they have raised their voice. They have been led superbly by Pravin Gordhan, who is their figurehead, and they've backed him as far as they can. They need to continue to back him. They need to build, as I think is now happening, a strong cross-sector campaign that is about defending the Constitution and about removing President Zuma from power. And there are several organisations calling for that. There is a Save South Africa campaign now, which is led by Seppo Tiana, Trevor Manuel and others, which has one single person, which is to save South Africa from President Zuma, to persuade the ANC in Parliament to remove him. Remember, President Zuma was not directly elected. He has no popular mandate. He was elected by Parliament and therefore by the ANC majority in Parliament. And I see the sands are shifting quite fast within the ANC. Just in the last 2 weeks, the way that Parliament has begun to be much more vigorous in its oversight on the SABC, on a number of issues. Jackson Mthembu, the chief whip of the ANC, speaking out quite vigorously in his personal capacity in support of Pravin Gordhan. These are all indications that there is change in the air.
That's very optimistic, and I'm sure what you're saying is music to some people's ears, but I can't help but just flash back to hours earlier today when there was a crowd of protesters at the gates of the Public Protector's office with posters saying, "Hands off Zuma, Thuli Madonsela is a puppet of white monopoly capital, and I absolutely must say that we do have a problem with monopoly capital and the private sector, and there are definite questions we need to deal with there. But there's obviously a camp, there's a group of people both within politics but also on the ground who don't want Jacob Zuma to go anywhere anytime soon. And I wonder what the probability is that he will be recalled or he will be removed any time soon, or if, as I imagine it, or in my estimation and analysis, it's going to be a slow bleed. Because that seems to be the approach the ANC has taken up to this point, even with the elections and the poor results in our votes.
Depends what happens in the next few days in relation to Pravin Gordhan. If Zuma calculates that it would be too dangerous to remove him, then the policy of containment of Zuma will continue. He'll probably survive, as you suggest, at least until the end of next year when the ANC elects the successor. And the sort of low road scenario at that point is that Mr. Zuma concludes that, well, for whatever reason, such as the fraud charges coming back in against him, or because of the needs of his cronies around him, or because he just wants to hang on to power, because power is his game,
yes,
then he may take what I call the Putin option, which I put at about 20% in the book, Make or Break, and try and drive the car from the back seat by running for a third term as ANC president. Ironically, what Thabo Mbeki tried to do in Polokwane, which Zuma stood up to, build a strong coalition against, and won. And of course, our political history changed after Polokwane in 2007.
Yes.
And I think we're approaching another big moment. It's a very delicate year for the ANC, actually. I think it's in a very delicate space. It's under pressure from Malema. The opposition, of course, did very well in the local government elections, and it's having to come to terms with a big electoral setback. And so far, it doesn't really seem to have grappled with that nettle. It seems to be stuck in the first stage of grief, denial.
Well, I think hearing about, what's happened with the Public Protector report today, not knowing what's going on with state capture, really, I'm in grief about not finding out what's going on. I mean,
Yes.
some of us smell a rat, I certainly do, but we really don't know at this point. And you've said there the ANC is dealing with, the kind of consequences of the elections, but I think too, the opposition parties now have to come to terms with how they're going to negotiate being in minority kind of opposition government.
They do, and of course, the other story we haven't even mentioned, it's been such an amazing week with 4 or 5 huge political events. We haven't even mentioned the fact that Julius Malema has also had charges brought against him.
Yes.
Bizarrely under a 1956 apartheid-era law relating to riotous assembly and land grabbing. Now, that suggests that Mr. Zuma is fighting back on all fronts.
Yeah, bullish.
He's fighting hard against his main enemies. He's taken on Madonsela over her report. He's taken on Pravin Gordhan by having the charges brought by his loyal placemen in the National Prosecuting Authority, and he's also done something similar with Malema. Those are the 3 biggest threats to Zuma's power: Madonsela, Malema, and Pravin Gordhan. And all 3 have been subjected to attack in the last literally 3 days. How that works out is crucial to the future, obviously.
So we've had an absolutely gripping week of news in South Africa. Public Protector doing her final press conference there, giving us some information, but not really what many of us wanted to hear. Also news that Pravin Gordhan from our finance ministry is being locked with charges of fraud, and then charges against Julius Malema from an act that's decades old. So if you think it's over, I'm sorry to tell you, but I think we're in for a couple more weeks of gripping news, and it certainly sounds like some of those red flags that we've discussed this afternoon appear in Richard Callan's book. So thank you for your time, and please do let us know what you think of the conversation and the topics of discussion on our Facebook page and on Twitter.